December 22, 1944. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich stood in his command post, staring at a map of Belgium with the kind of smile that comes from watching your enemies fall apart. His 6th SS Panzer Army had just punched 60 kilometers deep into American defenses, and the reports flooding his desk painted a beautiful picture of chaos. Entire divisions retreating in disorder. Panic spreading through the ranks. Americans abandoning their positions. Dietrich turned to his chief of staff and said something that would come back to haunt him in the most brutal way possible. "Americans are not soldiers," he sneered. "They are merchants playing at war. When it comes to real battle, they run." He believed every word. The Nazi ideology had convinced him that American forces, with their diverse backgrounds and citizen soldiers, could never match the discipline and fanaticism of the SS. 4 days later, that same arrogant smile would be wiped off his face forever, and the merchants he mocked would be writing the rule book on modern warfare. 800 kilometers to the south, in the French town of Nancy, another general was looking at the same map. But George Patton wasn't smiling. His face showed cold, calculated fury mixed with something else, something that scared his staff officers more than German tanks. It was anticipation. While Dietrich was celebrating what he thought was inevitable victory, Patton was preparing to pull off the most incredible maneuver in modern military history. He told his commanders something that sounded completely insane. "In 48 hours, he said, his voice sharp as a blade, "we will pivot the entire Third Army 90 degrees and strike a blow the Germans will never forget." His staff thought he'd lost his mind. An entire army, 90-degree turn, 48 hours. In the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, through ice, snow, and chaos. But what they didn't know was that Patton had been planning for this exact moment, and the Germans had no idea what was coming. To understand how this disaster unfolded for the Germans, you need to know what Hitler was gambling on. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was supposed to be Nazi Germany's last great offensive. Hitler handpicked the Ardennes forest for his attack because it was the weakest point in the Allied lines. The same forest where the Germans had broken through in 1940. American commanders thought the terrain was too difficult for a major offensive, so they'd left it lightly defended. Hitler's plan was audacious and desperate in equal measure. Drive through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies in two, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. Then he could focus everything on fighting the Soviets in the East. It was the strategy of a man who knew he was losing, but refused to accept reality. And for the first few days, it actually worked. The offensive launched on December 16th caught the Americans completely off guard. Entire regiments were overrun. Communications broke down. Commanders lost contact with their units. The weather was so bad that Allied air superiority meant nothing. Planes couldn't fly in the fog and snow. German tanks rolled forward almost unopposed in some sectors, and American troops fell back in confusion. But something else was happening during that German advance, something that would fuel American determination in a way Hitler never anticipated. Kampfgruppe Piper, an SS unit under Dietrich's command, committed what would become known as the Malmedy Massacre. On December 17th, near the crossroads at Bonnier, SS soldiers gunned down 84 unarmed American prisoners of war. The Americans had surrendered, been disarmed, and were standing in a field when the SS opened fire with machine guns. Those who survived the initial volley were hunted down and shot. This wasn't an isolated incident either. Piper's unit would be linked to multiple atrocities against both American POWs and Belgian civilians during their advance. When news of the massacre spread through American units, something changed. The confusion and fear turned into rage. Soldiers who might have considered surrendering now fought to the death. The SS had meant to terrorize the Americans into collapse, but instead they'd created an enemy that would show no mercy. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because the man who would turn this disaster into triumph had his own dark history. George Patton was brilliant, but he was also controversial as hell. Just over a year earlier, he'd been relieved of command in Sicily after slapping 2 soldiers suffering from what we'd now call PTSD. He called them cowards, accused them of faking their conditions, and physically assaulted them in field hospitals. The incidents nearly ended his career. While other generals were planning D-Day, Patton was sitting on the sidelines, his reputation in tatters. Eisenhower kept him around because he knew Patton was the best combat commander he had. But the slapping incidents proved Patton lacked the temperament for strategic command. He was too volatile, too unpredictable, too willing to let his ego override his judgment. Bradley, Patton's former subordinate, was given command of the First Army for D-Day, while Patton was used as a decoy, commanding a fake army group to fool the Germans about where the invasion would land. But Patton had one officer on his staff who saw things others missed. Colonel Oscar Koch, his intelligence chief, had been tracking German movements and noticed something alarming in early December. The Germans were massing forces across from the Ardennes. Koch wrote reports predicting a major offensive. He briefed Patton repeatedly, and Patton, for all his flaws, listened. Here's where the mythology gets messy, though. For decades, people believed Patton had predicted the Battle of the Bulge with almost supernatural accuracy. His diary entries seemed to show he knew exactly what was coming, but recent analysis has revealed something awkward. Patton went back and edited his diary after the fact, making his predictions seem more accurate than they actually were. He fabricated the myth of his own prescience. The truth is, Koch predicted the offensive, not Patton. But Patton was smart enough to prepare contingency plans based on Koch's intelligence, and that's what mattered when the crisis hit. He'd ordered his staff to draw up plans for how the Third Army could pivot north if needed. When Eisenhower called that desperate meeting at Verdun on December 19th, Patton was ready. That meeting at Verdun was one of the most dramatic moments of the war. Eisenhower gathered his top commanders in a cold, dimly lit room. The situation was catastrophic. The German offensive had created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name. American units were surrounded. Communications were failing. Nobody knew exactly where German units were or how far they'd advance. Eisenhower needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He turned to Patton and asked how quickly he could disengage from his current operations in the Saar region, wheel his army 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German offensive. Patton's answer shocked everyone in the room. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals thought he was joking or boasting. One army couldn't just turn on a dime like that. The logistics alone were impossible. Moving an entire army meant coordinating 133,000 vehicles, repositioning 62,000 tons of supplies, and getting over 250,000 men to change direction in the middle of winter." Patton wasn't joking, though. He gave a 2-word code to his headquarters: "Play ball." That was the signal his staff had been waiting for. The contingency plans Koch had helped prepare were already in motion before Patton left the meeting. What happened next defies belief, even when you know the facts. Patton's Third Army executed the most complex logistical maneuver of World War II. Staff officers had been working on 3 different attack plans depending on what Eisenhower ordered. When play ball came through, they activated the one that called for attacking toward Bastogne. Within hours, orders were flowing down the chain of command. Units that had been fighting east suddenly turned north. Supply convoys were rerouted. Artillery units displaced and moved to new positions. The entire army pivoted like a massive door swinging on its hinges, and they did it in the worst possible conditions. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the coldest in European history. Roads were sheets of ice. Visibility dropped to almost nothing in blowing snow. Vehicles broke down in the freezing temperatures. Soldiers marched through conditions that would have stopped most armies cold. But Patton had built a culture of aggressive movement in the Third Army, and his subordinates knew that failure wasn't an option. Meanwhile, 100 kilometers to the north, the situation in Bastogne was becoming desperate. The town sat at a crucial crossroads where 7 roads converged. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed it to continue their advance. The Americans knew that if Bastogne fell, the entire southern flank would collapse. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units, had been rushed to Bastogne and told to hold at all costs. By December 20th, they were completely surrounded. Over 18,000 American soldiers were trapped in a shrinking perimeter with limited ammunition, almost no medical supplies, and no way to evacuate their wounded. The Germans brought up artillery and began systematically pounding the town. On December 22nd, the same day Dietrich was feeling confident, German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They delivered an ultimatum to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the defenders: surrender or be annihilated. McAuliffe's response became legendary. Nuts. When the German officers looked confused, an American officer explained, "It means go to hell." That same day, something else happened that's become part of the Patton mythology. The weather was still terrible, fog and clouds keeping Allied aircraft grounded while German forces moved freely. Patton called in his Third Army chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, and ordered him to write a weather prayer. The chaplain was stunned. Pray for good weather so we can kill more efficiently? Patton didn't care about the theological implications. He wanted a prayer that would boost morale and, if possible, actually change the weather. O'Neill wrote a prayer asking for clear skies so that Allied forces could use their air superiority. Patton had it printed on cards and distributed to every soldier in the Third Army. Whether through divine intervention or just meteorological luck, the weather did clear on December 23rd. Allied fighter bombers filled the skies, hammering German positions and supply lines. The Germans suddenly found themselves exposed, and their advance ground to a halt. But the defenders of Bastogne were still surrounded and running out of everything. Patton's forces were pushing north as fast as humanly possible, but they weren't having an easy time of it. The 4th Armored Division was spearheading the relief effort, and they were fighting for every kilometer. The Germans knew what was coming and had set up defensive positions along the route. American tanks and infantry had to fight through one roadblock after another, often in brutal close-quarters combat. The winter conditions made everything harder. Tanks slipped on icy roads. Soldiers couldn't dig foxholes in frozen ground. Weapons jammed from the cold. Communications equipment failed. But the 4th Armored kept pushing, knowing that thousands of men in Bastogne were depending on them. On December 26th, they finally broke through. elements of the 37th Tank Battalion made contact with the 101st Airborne's perimeter. Bastogne was relieved. The siege wasn't over. The Germans would continue attacking the town for weeks, but the psychological impact was enormous. The invincible German offensive had been stopped. Back at Dietrich's headquarters, the atmosphere had changed completely. The confident predictions of victory had evaporated. The SS Panzer Army that was supposed to be rolling toward Antwerp was instead fighting desperately to avoid encirclement. American forces were attacking from the south. British forces were moving in from the north. The weather had cleared, and Allied aircraft were destroying German armor faster than it could be replaced. Dietrich's merchants playing at war had just handed him the most humiliating defeat of his career. Hitler's grand plan was falling apart. The fuel shortage that German planners had warned about was now crippling operations. Tanks ran out of gas and had to be abandoned. Supply convoys couldn't get through because Allied aircraft controlled the skies. And the Americans weren't just stopping the German advance. They were preparing to destroy the entire salient. This is where another controversy enters the story. Patton wanted to do something audacious and ruthless. Instead of just pushing the Germans back, he wanted to drive straight through the base of the Bulge, cutting off the entire German force, trap them, encircle them, and destroy them completely. It was the kind of aggressive maneuver that could have shortened the war by months. But Bradley and Eisenhower said no. They chose a more conservative approach, pushing the Germans back gradually, rather than risking a bold stroke. Bradley's decision has been debated by military historians ever since. Some argue he was right to avoid the risk. Patton's plan could have overextended American forces and led to disaster. Others contend that Bradley was too cautious and that Patton's aggressive approach could have ended the war in early 1945 before the Soviets advanced so far into Eastern Europe. We'll never know what would have happened, but Patton was furious. He felt his superiors were throwing away an opportunity for a decisive victory because they were afraid to take risks. The fighting dragged on through January. American forces gradually pushed the Germans back to their original positions. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945. The cost was staggering. American casualties topped 89,000, including almost 19,000 dead. German casualties were even higher, estimated at over 100,000, including troops they couldn't replace. Hundreds of tanks and aircraft were destroyed. The German offensive had failed completely, and worse, it had wasted resources Germany desperately needed for defending against the Soviet advance in the east. Hitler's gamble had backfired catastrophically. But the human cost went beyond the casualty statistics. The Malmedy massacre and other SS atrocities had poisoned any remaining notion of honorable warfare on the Western Front. American soldiers who discovered evidence of SS war crimes often responded with their own brutal reprisals. After the war ended, there would be a reckoning for those atrocities. The Malmedy massacre trials began in May 1946 at Dachau. 74 SS members were charged with war crimes, including Joachim Peiper, who commanded the unit that committed the massacre, and Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the entire 6th SS Panzer Army. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivor testimony, physical evidence from the massacre sites, confessions from some of the defendants who tried to save themselves by implicating their comrades. The tribunal handed down 43 death sentences, including both Peiper and Dietrich. 22 defendants got life sentences. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn. None of the death sentences were ever carried out. In the emerging Cold War environment, the United States decided that executing too many Germans might damage relations with West Germany, which was now an ally against the Soviet Union. The sentences were reviewed, reduced, and eventually most of the perpetrators were released. Piper got out in 1956. Dietrich was released in 1955. The man who had commanded an army that murdered American prisoners, who had sneered at American soldiers as merchants, served less than 10 years. Justice was postponed, and then it was abandoned. Meanwhile, Patton's reputation was reaching mythical status. The relief of Bastogne became his defining moment, overshadowing everything else he'd accomplished in North Africa, Sicily, and France. The story of the Third Army's impossible 90-degree turn was told and retold, each version adding new layers of legend. Books were written, movies were made. Patton became the symbol of American military excellence. But the reality was more complicated than the myth. Yes, he had prepared contingency plans based on intelligence warnings. Yes, his army had pulled off an incredible logistical feat, but he hadn't single-handedly won the Battle of the Bulge. The defenders of Bastogne held on through incredible courage and determination before he arrived. The weather clearing had as much to do with Allied success as any single general's decisions, and Patton's predictions hadn't been as supernatural as his edited diary suggested. The man had fabricated parts of his own legend. Then came December 9th, 1945. Patton was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car collided with a truck. The other passengers were barely injured, but Patton suffered severe spinal injuries that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He was rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg, where he lingered in agony for 12 days before dying on December 21st. The official story was straightforward: a tragic accident. But almost immediately, conspiracy theories began to emerge. Patton had been making inflammatory statements about the Soviets, arguing that the United States should immediately confront them before they consolidated control of Eastern Europe. He'd been making controversial statements about German soldiers, suggesting many of them had just been following orders and should be treated leniently. He'd criticized denazification policies as too harsh. Some claimed his views were embarrassing to the U.S. government and the military establishment. The conspiracy theories claimed the accident was staged, that Patton was assassinated by OSS operatives working with Soviet intelligence. Books were written claiming a mysterious Polish assassin finished the job in the hospital with cyanide. The evidence for assassination is thin at best. The conspiracy theories rely heavily on a single questionable source, Douglas Bazata, a former OSS operative who made wild claims decades after the events. His story involved Star Wars-like weapons and untraceable poisons. Historians who've examined the evidence conclude that Patton's death was almost certainly an accident, tragic, but not mysterious. But the conspiracy theories persist because they fit the narrative people want to believe. The warrior silenced because he spoke uncomfortable truths. The legend cut down by shadowy forces. It makes for a better story than he died in a car accident. And that's the thing about Patton. The myth and the man have become so entangled that separating them is almost impossible. Was he a military genius? Absolutely. Was he also a flawed human being who fabricated parts of his legacy? Also, yes. Can both things be true? They have to be. Looking back at the Battle of the Bulge from 8 decades later, what stands out is how completely the tables turned. Dietrich's arrogant prediction that Americans would run when faced with real battle was thrown back in his face in the most brutal way possible. The merchants had not only stopped the German offensive, They'd pivoted an entire army in conditions that should have made movement impossible, relieved a surrounded garrison, and then pushed the Germans all the way back to their starting positions. The Third Army's maneuver became a case study in military schools around the world. It demonstrated what was possible when you combined aggressive leadership, detailed planning, flexible logistics, and soldiers willing to endure incredible hardship. Modern military doctrine about rapid deployment and combined arms operations traces its lineage directly back to what Patton accomplished in December 1944. But we also have to sit with uncomfortable truths. The greatest American triumph in the Battle of the Bulge was partly built on manufactured mythology. Patton edited his diary to make himself look more prescient. He took credit for predictions his intelligence officer made. The weather prayer story, while factually true, was exaggerated into something almost supernatural. Hollywood would later turn Patton into a larger-than-life hero who barely resembled the complicated, controversial man. And on the German side, the perpetrators of atrocities got away with slaps on the wrist because political considerations overrode justice. Dietrich, who commanded forces that murdered American prisoners, who embodied Nazi ideology, who sneered at democratic soldiers as inferior, served less time in prison than many people serve for nonviolent crimes. The neat ending where good triumphs over evil and justice prevails, that's not what happened. The Battle of the Bulge still matters, though, not despite these complications, but because of them. It shows us that history is messy. Heroes can be flawed. Victories can be partial. Justice can be incomplete. The Americans who fought in the Ardennes weren't mythical figures. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things in terrible conditions. The soldiers who held Bastogne against impossible odds. The tank crews who pushed through German defenses in the freezing cold. The logistics personnel who kept supplies moving when everything should have ground to a halt. The medics who treated wounded men in conditions that made surgery almost impossible. Those are the real stories that matter, not the manufactured legends. And the fact that Patton edited his diary, or that justice wasn't fully served, doesn't diminish what those soldiers accomplished. It just reminds us that real history is complicated, and sometimes the myth and the truth are both powerful in their own ways.